Hello, everyone. Welcome to our final Public Health Plus session of this series, Public Health Plus Cross-Sector Experience. As Diego mentioned, my name is Michelle James, and I am the Senior Director of Alumni Engagement at the Rollins School of Public Health at Emory University here in Atlanta, Georgia. We're thrilled to have you here today. The Public Health Plus series was created by the Rollins School of Public Health Alumni Board Career Development Committee in partnership with our good friends at Orange Sparkleball to examine the spaces where public health intersects with other disciplines, discuss the work, and then hopefully broaden our thinking. Throughout our series, we've heard from a variety of speakers who work outside of what some might call traditional public health, but whose work certainly impacts the health of all. Our conversations have highlighted the core values and skill sets in public health and their importance across many disciplines. Today, we will examine how having a diverse range of professional experience can create a valuable leadership skill experience, knowledge base, and an ability to bridge across many disciplines, making for more productive outcomes. So without further delay, let's meet today's speakers. Megan Kennedy is the founder of Orange Sparkleball, an innovation and impact consultancy that accelerates initiatives in the private and public sector, as well as working with startups. She earned her Master's of Public Health degree in epidemiology from the Rollins School of Public Health and conducted HIV research at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention for 7 years before pivoting her career toward design thinking and strategy innovation. Megan is a member of the Rollins School of Public Health Alumni Board and has served as a guest reviewer at Georgia Tech since 2007, as a judge for the Global Social Venture Competition and Industrial Design Society of America, a mentor for social entrepreneurs, and is frequently invited to sit on innovation and entrepreneurial panels. Niles Friedman is a global cross-sector leader specializing in new business and product creation. For the last 10 plus years, he's focused on building innovation capacity and function, creating technology, strategic planning programs, and instilling sustainable culture change across the U.S. federal government, state of California, Los Angeles County, and many international health ministries. Currently, an executive advisor with Stars Insights, which is a strategic advisory firm based in Los Angeles, Niles works with social impact organizations and leaders. Previously, as a strategic advisor with the CEO's Office for Los Angeles County, he advised and delivered on functions such as technology-driven strategic planning, innovation, and was part of the core leadership that launched the county's first analytics center of excellence. Niles also previously worked with the California Health and Human Services Agency to establish their Office of Innovation that improves the delivery of services through human-centered design approaches, digital services, and insights from data and analytics. During the Obama administration, he served as a senior advisor with the U.S. Small Business Administration. Niles spent several years working and living across the continent of Africa, and he served as the vice president of Broadreach Corporation, where he launched a global commercial market development division to improve product and service access in collaboration with health system leaders, government agencies, and private sector partners. Like Megan, Niles is also a proud, may I say proud, Niles, alumnus of Rollins School of Public Health, having earned his master's in public health in health policy and management. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Megan today to have a great conversation with Niles about how his diverse range of experience has been beneficial to him in addressing some of the world's greatest public health challenges. Megan?
Michelle, thank you very much. So Niles and I talk a lot about, we have had a kind of similar bizarre career trajectory. And when I listen to our bios, I can imagine that people might be thinking, what in the world do these people do? So Niles, I'm going to hand it to you to explain. No, in all seriousness, if you'll tell us about yourself, obviously we know each other pretty well, but can you walk us through your background and give us a little bit of the thread through it so we at least have kind of the foundational information to start this conversation?
Absolutely. Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned that when I talk about this work a lot of times with family or close friends, they know that I'm doing something with intention, but sometimes it's like, okay, so you're doing tech and policy, and I'm like, yes, tech and policy, yeah. No, I'm really excited, and I appreciate the opportunity to engage with the alumni group and Michelle and the team, and yeah, just really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you today. We always have good conversations and can get a little wonky, but it's always fun. Yeah, I think when I was thinking about my career to date, I was kind of thinking about it through a couple of different stages, and maybe that's a good way to frame it, and we can kind of go deep into areas that might be relevant for folks and or of interest. So when I came out of Rollins, I had pretty strong intent to go into consulting. I knew I wanted to do something where I could build up some business skills, build up a foundation of sort of client service, but also I was interested in like new product development and how to think about growth in organizations. So I spent about, I would say the first stage of my career was about 8 years, a little under 10 years in management consulting. So I worked with Deloitte, and then I worked for a company called the Advisory Board Company based in DC. And it was all healthcare consulting. So it was really connected in with HPM focus, but it really built this foundation that I go back to even in roles right now. And so, at the time, I didn't know that it would be that foundational, but it has definitely been that way. And so, the ability to work with 50 different partners in a matter of 5 years with one firm, and to help to create new products and services and test those in the market, and to do traditional business development and sort of hone in on like those types of skills. I mean, those are really, they just permeate any kind of sector, right? Any kind of industry, you can pull in aspects of that work. So I always kind of consider that to be kind of the first stage. And then there was this second stage, which, I mean, it really does go back to actually one seminar I attended at Rollins, which was around HIV and AIDS. And we all know about Dean Curran's history and passion for that area. And I remember really connecting with just the global health dimension of that work. And so at the time when I was working for the advisory board, I was based in DC, and started getting connected into some of the global health networks and just meeting folks, the World Bank, WHO, IFC, and just kind of seeing like, was there a space, with that foundation of work, could I jump into maybe something more traditional through the lens of global health? And the long story short, I joined a startup, and at the time it was called Broadreach Healthcare. And it was this premise of how do we bring in management consulting approaches and principles, and looking at systems, not necessarily tech, but sort of a systems lens of how to build capacity in hospitals and health systems, but to do that in rural clinics in South Africa that were treating HIV positive patients. And so it was a big leap of faith. I was based in DC, but then lived abroad for a bunch of years. And I did a lot of health system strengthening work, really working with national and provincial, local levels of government. And this is where that intersection between the private and the public really started to form. So it was a private LLC, the startup, but 90% of our partners were government. And so we were directly serving government partners in South Africa, and then this expanded into countries like Nigeria and Kenya and Chad. But again, through the lens of health system strengthening and building capacity into how to treat people and to treat local residents. And during the time with the startup, it was also an opportunity to work on creating a new business line. So this goes back into some of the private sector work that I had done in consulting. How do we create a new business line to support point of care delivery for products? So this was around working with pharma companies that were manufacturing antiretrovirals or vaccines or medical devices. And we were working with them in alignment with government partners in countries, again, like Nigeria, Chad, Kenya, South Africa, Tanzania, to basically create new models for service delivery. And at the end of the day, getting those products to the point of care. So for cervical cancer vaccines, which is a big product we work with one pharma company on, is literally how do you get the vaccine into the arm of 13-year-old girls? And we were trying to figure out new models for distribution and service delivery. So yeah, just an amazing sort of period, but it really started to hone in on this idea of cross-sector experience, because I was working with private sector partners, the public sector, government at all levels in countries in Africa. But then it really started to get into this element of community-based organizations and nonprofits. And so we couldn't do everything as Broadreach. We had to partner with local groups and organizations that had that credibility and trust and subject matter expertise. And so really started to blow out this model of like how you could work in a cross-sector way to solve some of these larger public health challenges and issues. So that's kind of that second.
So before,
oh, yeah, go ahead.
Before you go on to kind of the next stage of your career, let me stop you because I think we were probably working in Africa about the same time.
Okay.
And my experience, so I was working at CDC with WHO, and my experience was very much sort of the traditional public health experience. So as you were talking about working in global health with pharma and really wedding those two areas, was that something that other people were doing? I mean, that happens now, like I think of Gavi. It's not an uncommon thing now, but from my experience then, assuming we were about the same time, that would have been really outside of my kind of purview. Give us some context about, was that brand new? Did the global health people think you were crazy, and did the startup people think you were crazy?
I think the short answer would be yes and yes, right?
Okay.
No, but yeah, so the Broadreach, it was interesting because it's a really great question because it contextualizes this. And this period was 2007 through 2012. So it was about a 5-year span. When I first started with Broadreach, we were doing traditional global health system strengthening work. So our funding was from USAID. We got funding from PEPFAR, and we were literally on the ground in 5 of the 9 provinces in South Africa. We had like 400 clinics that we were connected to, and we were building out capacity to support testing and treatment and educating doctors and other clinicians, looking at infrastructure, looking at data and monitoring and evaluation sort of approaches. So we were really building out it was a matrixed approach to looking at solving this one issue, which obviously is a massive undertaking, but it was that kind of systems way of thinking. And I sort of framed that because when we were thinking about new businesses, we were thinking about, well, again, this goes back to that theme we talked about last week of value. Like, where could Broadreach provide value at a different scale, but stay true to its mission, stay true to what we believed and the approaches we really focused on when we were doing more traditional global health work. So when we were engaging with pharma and medical device and diagnostic companies, the value is looking at their value chain from the point of a product getting registered all the way through to last mile at the point of care delivery. And our sweet spots were on the back end because we had done all this health system strengthening work. We knew about different distribution models and different approaches and different ways where you could, when you look at the geography of a certain province, how do you create hubs for treatment that are more conducive to people getting their antiretrovirals in a matter of hours versus having to travel 4 days, which then just reduces their ability to stay adherent to their treatment. So this was where the value, I think, for our pharma partners was really starting to come into play because they were looking at it through the lens, not their traditional commercial departments, but more through the lens of kind of corporate social responsibility and how do you price things in a sort of scaled way to support improved access to those products. So we were looking at, we call them value-added services. We were thinking about new ways to engage with local government. So the product can come in and then we would work with the local government partners and clinics to support treatment programs or education programs that was connecting back into our global health program because we had done that well in South Africa. Yeah.
It's fascinating. So I'm sorry to take you off your career trajectory.
No, I love talking about this stuff.
Dive into that.
Yeah, but it's a good question, Megan, because it really does start to push the dialogue of what cross-sector can be. Because I mean, candidly, I think in the global health space, some people might say, "Well, you're working with pharma, you're working with medical device and diagnostic companies," and I think we had a good filter for really understanding like intention and like how we could add value back, and were they a good partner to align with what we were thinking about at a local level? Do they believe in the different types of health system strengthening programs and distribution models that we had tested out and have worked on in a few countries? So this was really early stages, but to your point, I think there was, I don't know if it was conflict, but it was a question about intent, right? Like, how does that all align? How does a for-profit pharma company align with government? How do you ensure that there's a level of continuity there? And at the end of the day, really, you're serving the public.
Yeah, I think that intent is a really good way to think about it. I was in Kenya a little bit before you were talking, but one of the big aha moments I had was I was at a study site that was about 4 hours away from where we were based, so it was pretty rural, and Coca-Cola had figured out distribution into that very rural area. And that was when I had the aha moment that if we could figure out how to get the best of all the sectors and put those together, and it seems like you were ahead of my thinking there. So I'm fascinated by it.
Well, it's really interesting because one of the founders, that was in the early stages, that was one of the ways he would frame the work. So when we would go into rural areas in South Africa, you would see pop-up shops for phones, for cellular phones, and Coca-Cola was one of them. And it's like, wait a second, they have figured out a way to distribute their products into these rural, remote areas of South Africa. Well, how do we do that for vaccines and antiretroviral? I mean, it was when he peeled back the layers of what we were trying to do, it was exactly aligned to what you're describing. Because if they had done it, well, what do we learn from them in the context of distribution for healthcare products and services? Yeah.
Absolutely.
The other part on this
right,
one, no, I love talking about this stuff. The other part to your question was, you were asking, was this sort of new? And it was. I mean, there were countries like Chad where we had identified them given the need, but given the remote nature of the way that country's set up. And, this country in particular, and there were quite a few, and this is broader across emerging markets, of course, but they had never had that kind of focused dedication to support, right, distribution, in this case, of antiretrovirals into communities. So there was this way of creating something from scratch and really aligning it to, I'll call them users, right? That's kind of the buzz term now, but it was like patients. It was people that needed to get tested or they needed to get treated. And we were working with the national government to figure out ways to distribute these products and to create programs that allowed for improved adherence and improved education of not only communities, but doctors. And that's where the whole value-added services model came in.
Got it. All right, I will let you get back to, because we're focusing on just a very small part of your career. So if you could tell us kind of the more recent stuff, and then we can kind of do some more deep dives into different areas.
For sure, yeah. So that's kind of that second stage. And, as I said, this was where I really started going deep into public sector work, working with governments, and I just really loved it. I mean, it was just a different way to think about problem solving and collaboration. And as I mentioned, this work was where I started seeing how NGO partners, how we could partner with them and really sort of think about scale at a different level, and community-based organizations as well. And so in 2012, I had an opportunity to work for the Obama campaign and grew up in Chicago, had seen him in action on the south side of Chicago, really just was connected to what he stood for. And so I jumped in and I joined the campaign, and then there was an opportunity to work with the Small Business Administration, it was not traditional public health, but it was sort of industry agnostic, but it really connected in with what work I had done with a startup for 5 years, and just knowing what startups struggle with and looking at funding and infrastructure and even down to government contracts. In the global health space, you are looking at contracts to support funding and to support your organization for delivery. So this was kind of where I got into more of the domestic public sector work. And I just, again, really loved it. I loved the fact that I could connect back into the US, be part of an administration. But this was also, as you know, a period of time where the civic innovation, civic tech movement was really starting to grow. So in 2012, there was the launch of the Presidential Innovation Fellows Program. In 2013, 14, and 15, You had the U.S. Digital Service and 18F, which are these digital consultancy groups within the federal government that had been launched. And this was where civic tech was really starting to grow. But you also had nonprofits like Code for America that had been leading this movement for quite a few years before, and also engagement in the UK with a gentleman by the name of Mike Bracken, who was leading a lot of digital transformation work in the public sector. So it was this amazing time to kind of see all of this start to bubble up. And one of the organizations that I had heard about as well in more the civic innovation space was Fuse Corps. And Fuse Corps is based, it's a nonprofit based in San Francisco, and they pair up mid-career execs into local and state levels of government for a one-year fellowship to look at civic issues from infrastructure, transportation, women's empowerment, you name it. It's really driven by the leaders in government saying, hey, we'd like to bring in a fellow to collaborate with us for a year. And there was an opportunity to work with the state of California to launch their first Office of Innovation. And I just, the short is I just jumped at the opportunity. I met the leadership team who these folks had this vision. And I remember sitting in the interview in Sacramento, and it was around this like oval table of like 3 leaders that I worked a lot with. And I just remember thinking like, I don't know what this is, but I want to be part of it. And I mean, it was one of those gut instincts. You could just feel it, you could tell. And anyway, so yeah, I joined Fuse Corps. I joined the state for my fellowship for a year, and then stayed on for another about a little less than 2 years to help build out the Office of Innovation. We hired a director. It was great to work with this like core innovation group that our lead at the time, the undersecretary for this agency, had put together to really think about culture change in this massive agency on a very different level. And then the last 3 years, I've had an opportunity to work at the local levels of government in Los Angeles with Los Angeles County, as Michelle mentioned. And then Stars Insights is a group of, I'll call them like social impact advisors, folks that have worked in either government or the philanthropic space. A lot of us have private sector backgrounds as well. And the idea is to work with government foundations, nonprofits, and really think strategically about how to best position them for success. So this is kind of where it's really interesting when I look back at some of that global health work and really understanding the nonprofit sort of ecosystem, if you will. It's like now I'm really doing direct work with a lot of nonprofits to really help to think about strategically, not only their mission, but how do you operationalize your mission and really start to think about outcomes and impact in a different way.
So thank you. I think you've demonstrated the cross-sector part of this very effectively over the last 5 minutes. One of the things that, as we were talking, you talked about being in the Small Business Association, and then you talked about that was sort of your step away from public health. And I challenged you, and this is obviously from my background, but I challenged you that didn't seem like a step away from public health to me, because the health of the community is so driven by, what's happening with small businesses. So you could make a direct line in my mind. And obviously this is coming from a group that is just as likely to work with the Chamber of Commerce as with the, CDC. But can you talk a little bit about, are we aligned in that thinking, or do you feel like it's a stretch that going to the health of the community in terms of the economic health is directly aligned with public health? Like, how do you think about that?
No, it's a great question. I definitely align with your thinking, right? And I go more into the lens of social determinants of health. When you think about sort of the broader context, I can absolutely see what you're saying. So one of the things that I worked on when I was with the Small Business Administration was a lot of our outreach and communication about what SBA did and what it could do for local communities. So we would host these sort of workshops, and we did some regulatory fairness hearings, which got a little wonky, but more into the technical aspects of how regulations were impacting small business ecosystems in cities or states. But you're absolutely right, because if in a lot of cities, as we know, when small businesses are thriving, communities are thriving, right? And so there is a direct connection, and then I get into the social determinants lens of, well, if small businesses are thriving, communities are thriving, they have better access to health services. You know what I mean? Like it's just this, it's the trickle effect. It's the concentric circles of how that can operate. It doesn't mean that small businesses are only directly connected to, right, public health outcomes,
Right.
but I do think there is a direct connection. And it is one of the things I did see through these outreach events was how in communities that had been really hit hard and there was not a small business, an environment that was conducive to small businesses, you did see a lot of other trickle effects where hospitals had shut down, clinics had shut down, because there just wasn't demand for those services because people had left to find jobs in new communities. And it might be 20 miles down the road, but when everyone's leaving because there's new jobs in a community 20 miles down the road, a lot of times the infrastructure that was built into that community from the beginning starts to dissipate. So I absolutely see a connection. One of the things when I was with the state of California, I wasn't directly involved in it, but they launched an effort called Let's Get Healthy California. And it was exactly looking at what you're describing of social determinants. What are all the different factors that are going to impact the health outcomes of residents in our state? And small business and economic development were definitely components of that.
It's super interesting because as I look, and we talked about this a little bit, but this is the last of the Public Health Plus conversations for this. Michelle, I like how you called it series. We've been calling it season 1 and starting to think about season 2, but you're hitting on, basically everything we've talked about. So community strengthening, civ tech. So we have covered each of these areas, and you're kind of nicely kind of pulling them into a cohesive leadership projection or something like that. Like how all of these things can kind of come in to really allow you to think truly at a systems level. That wasn't super articulate, but that's where my
but it's that connection that they all can work. It's because I think one of the things, and you mentioned this early on, I think it's true, is sometimes we can get into these silos. So I work in the private sector, I work in the public, I work in the social impact, I work with nonprofit, and there is a time and place where maybe some of that segmentation makes sense. But I saw this, and I know you saw this probably with the global health work you did. It wasn't even a nice to have, it was a necessity. I mean, the private sector and government and community-based organizations and nonprofits had to work together to really achieve the outcomes that everyone was collectively looking for. So I think it's becoming maybe more just more streamlined even in the United States to think about it through that lens. But your question on public health, I mean, public health is front and center for obvious reasons out of necessity. And I don't see that going away for at least the next couple of decades. And so where public health can play a role in almost being a unifier or, some level of like building a coalition, right? So then you bring in the different sectors, but using public health as a core tenet that everyone can rally around, I think could be really powerful.
For sure. And one of the things, so I believe she's still on, we had Terry Garska was here talking about community networks, and she was on earlier, but they're doing a lot of work in one of their projects with connecting different service providers in the community, and public health was one of the main drivers of that connectivity, the community strengthening. So there's actually data. Terry, if you want to put anything in the chat or pipe up on that, that would be totally fine. We're obviously going very chatty in this one. So I do think public health can be a real driver into the people who are part of this conversation. Having that public health experience, I think, is going to be a real differentiator. You're saying, as you said, a couple decades. I hope that's true for sure. I think we've all been positioned well over the last year.
Yeah, and I know we talked about this as well. There was an event I had the opportunity just to connect with on sort of careers, right? And sort of transitions of careers for alumni as well. And I think it's an interesting time too, where folks that bring in maybe a very traditional public health background and skill set, one, I think that type of skill set is really attractive regardless of sector. But I think second, and this, I use this example because it was such a straightforward example. There was someone on the call that said, hey, I'm a researcher. I've been a researcher for 10 years. How do I jump to a new sector? And it's this whole idea of one, understanding your value as a researcher, but then distilling maybe some of the less technical aspects of what you do, right? So when I think about a researcher, I think about quant skills and qualitative research skills and ability to synthesize and the ability to take a ton of data and distill it into something that for someone who doesn't have a technical background can understand. That is at the core of any sector. You know what I mean? Like when you can position and articulate that kind of value proposition back, I mean, you could drive your career, private sector, public sector, nonprofit, social impact, because those are just, again, it goes back to that idea of like these fundamental skills. And it also kind of transcends industry because, one of the things I learned in consulting was, and there's definitely some argument for bringing in folks that maybe don't have the depth of technical into a project. But if you have smart people, they'll figure it out, and the consulting group will give them enough time so that they are knowledgeable and have enough expertise to add value. But this idea of being able to jump into any industry with those kind of generalist skills, I think is you could really set out a career that might feel very different from what you're doing today. And I think that's actually really exciting as well.
That's actually something we talk about a lot. If you're too much of a subject matter expert, you tend to go really deep and it's hard to see the system level. And so I would argue that you're going to be a better innovator if you're a generalist, because then you don't get bogged down in the details of the, your SME. I can go deep in epi Twitter, but that's not what I'm doing for a living. I do it kind of for fun. That's my one area. But it would not make me a good innovator to go deep into epi Twitter. Anyway, that's a bad Twitter joke.
I 100% agree with you on that. I mean, I think it's proven in a couple of examples and work that I've done where, and it doesn't mean that you can't go into that level of technical expertise and build that up. But when you sometimes have less of it and maybe are a bit more maybe objective, because sometimes, I remember this in a couple of government environments, and it makes total sense because if you are a branch chief for a certain program, you are expected to know everything about that program. But sometimes you're very connected into what it is today, and sometimes can be less willing to say, hey, well, let's think about it differently, because then, your value connected to that technical expertise can sometimes shift. And I think I would agree, like where you can acknowledge that and support leaders like that to think about it in a different way, while relating enough to them so that they see that you understand where they're coming from and you're building this trust. I mean, that to me is kind of the perfect formula. And with the innovation at the state level in California, that was one of the big tenets. It wasn't about Niles and the core innovation team leading these initiatives. We called them innovation use case teams. It was creating the infrastructure so that the departments and the programs were actually the ones leading it. So the programs and the departments had a sponsor, they had a chair, and then they had core team members. And we were there to support them and provide resources and created this forum where they could showcase their work on a monthly basis. But at the end of the day, 90% of the work was being done by the department internal because they were vested, they were bought in, and that's where, we talked about this too, that's where sustainable culture change really comes into play in the space of innovation. Yeah.
For sure. All right, I'm going to go back up to what we actually prepped, so we're not going to super geek out in innovation. One of the things that we talked about is kind of giving going through each of the sectors where you've worked and thinking about what kind of where you are best positioned to add value in those areas. And I think this ties into something you talked about earlier, which was thinking about your experience and almost repackaging it as you talk to a new sector. And I'm not saying not be honest about what it is, but lead with a different set of experiences based on what sector you're talking about. And I think you're very eloquent in that, so I will just let you talk about that.
Sure, yeah. No, I think it's a great question. It's a great sort of, it's a great way to frame, I think, where a lot of folks in our alumni group might be thinking about, like, hey, you know, I want to get more involved in X sector, X industry. And I think with folks that are coming out of Rollins, folks that are in the public health space, folks that have worked in any of the sectors, I think you're just really well positioned right now. And the one example I will use goes back to the shift from that sort of first stage of healthcare management consulting in the States to global health startup. And it didn't take me a while to have a gut instinct that I knew I wanted to do it, but it did take me a while to think about, like, what was my value proposition? So candidly, I had not ever traveled to Africa. I'd never worked in Africa. I did not have expertise in the HIV and AIDS space. I did have a lot of healthcare consulting work. I had looked at health system strengthening. I'd worked at hospitals and health systems. And it was this ability to communicate when I was interviewing with this startup. So I interviewed with some of the folks in the DC office as well as abroad in South Africa. And it was just, to be honest, getting really humble that I was not going to come in and lead this entire team from the onset, but that I was going to bring in the value from consulting and knowing that that was a value add for the program, and knowing what the founders and what the leaders were thinking about strategically. I could see a niche. I could see an area where I could really add some value, but then also being really, I think, aware of the fact that I was a white American man coming into South Africa. And so my role was not to go into communities and try to educate them or convince them to get tested, right? We had to think about strategically, like, how do we engage with local community partners to support that so that we could drive some of the systems thinking and infrastructure and models and tools and resources that local partners could then use to actually deliver directly into these communities. And so I think it's a really important exercise. I've done that quite a few times at other points in my career. When I thought about working in California, having been in DC for over a decade and thinking about state government and working in California and where was I going to add value? I mean, I've worked in California, but I'd never lived there. I'm not from there, right? So I just think having that honest conversation with what are areas that I need to build up, and then really focusing on the areas that you think you can lead with. And that was interesting enough. When I was interviewing, there was a lot of interest in the fact that I had worked in Africa and had created these different ways. We didn't call it innovation, but we had talked about how to deliver services in a new way, in a different way. And they were intrigued by the fact that I had done that in other markets outside of the US. So that, with the consulting background, et cetera, was a good fit for them, because there was also, to your point earlier, I was a little agnostic to how the 13 departments operated. So I could bring in a different lens of objectivity while really ensuring that the value that they saw in the innovation office was being driven by the department leaders.
Well, that's like a playbook out of human-centered design right there, which leads right into innovation so perfectly.
Yeah.
Do you want to, can you kind of go through and talk about, I know that we talked about translation and we talked about how you deal with failure, and there are some kind of pieces of this that have come up, like the language that's developed in silos is very standard and everyone in the silo knows, but when you start trying to go across to another sector and you're using, even I smiled when you used use case, because that's a very specific innovation language, and I use it frequently, and I frequently get kind of either blank looks or I have no idea what you're talking about. But being aware of how you translate as you go across sectors is fascinating to me, and it's come up repeatedly in this series of Public Health Plus webinars.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I can kind of hone in on an example that I think is really relevant, just what you described with innovation. So when I joined the Health and Human Services Agency in California to work on establishing this Office of Innovation, again, with this core group, I remember very early on, I think it's when you've had some experience, we talked about a little bit about this with respect to resistance to change, coming into an environment where you're definitely seen as a bit of an outsider, and you're just picking up on what's going on in meetings, how people are engaging with you. And I can remember even in the first month of my fellowship, really honing in on the fact that we had to step back and define innovation, because candidly, innovation is a very nebulous term. It's overused. Sometimes it really doesn't have a lot of concrete meaning. And we had to engage the departments. So we had an initial cohort of 5 departments that we had targeted that were interested to engage initially, sort of your early adopters. And I spent a month like literally asking them basic questions, not even like, what does innovation mean to you? It was the Department of Public Health director, like, hey, Dr. Smith, like, what are your challenges? Like, talk to me about just basic business needs. Talk to me about what keeps you up at night. I mean, we were really trying to dispel like leading with anything that was coming from an innovation space. So we could kind of hear what they were struggling with, what they were challenged with, what they wanted to engage with, what they wanted to think about very differently. And so all of that collective input, I then analyze and synthesize with the core group to figure out, okay, well, here's that initial cohort of use case teams, which are basically like innovation incubator teams. Let's get those launched because we know that we have traction and engagement. But then when we start to think about the innovation office itself, let's use the language that collectively this department and the other 12 are really using. So we really tried to stay away from some of the buzzwords like human-centered design and design thinking and leading it with that until we had examples where they could enter into a lab. So that was another dimension of this, was giving people the experience of what this kind of Silicon Valley innovation really looked like. So we created an innovation lab for all of the chief deputy directors for the 13 departments and brought them into that experience so they could see tangibly. And we actually used these priority topics that we had synthesized with the departments and brought them into an experience that was very tactical. It was very tangible. I mean, one of the areas that we used was how to improve enrollment in food programs, which was directly connected to 3 departments that had said, we've got a mandate, we've got to improve enrollment. How do we do that in a different way? And so we used the innovation lab as this experience to really showcase like how to think differently about it and bring in those human-centered design thinking approaches. So I think of the language piece, I think you just have to be really cognizant. I mean, to me, human-centered design has a lot of tangible, concrete meaning. But for someone that's not in this space, I think you sometimes have to just peel it back. Let's peel back to its most basic elements. And then they can contextualize, oh, okay, that's human-centered design. Sometimes when you lead with a buzzy term, it's not that they're not interested. I have just found sometimes, like you said, they get a little waste-eyed. And they're like, well, I don't really know what that means. And it doesn't really fit into how I think. And I think that's another important dimension of this work is meeting people where they are. Because unless you do that, you're going to be directing innovation. I know we're talking about innovation in general, but you're going to be directing sort of change in a way that's conducive to how you think about it. And you might lose a lot of people along the way.
For sure.
Yeah.
I'm very aware of time. I'm going to ask you one more thing that I think is really important to just the idea of being able to go across sectors. But if there are questions, please put them in the chat. Terry, thank you for doing a better job of explaining the strength of public health than I did. I appreciate that. So Niles, you, when we talked, you talked about the ability to be uncomfortable, to go into, and you hit on that here a little bit, to kind of go into, and I think it's kind of humility and the ability to sit with discomfort. I have found that to be a really important ability that you have to kind of force yourself to develop. I don't know if you agree with that or if you think about it differently, but I think that's a huge piece of the ability to kind of go from one group to another effectively.
Mm-hmm. I think so, yeah. And I think for me, there's probably, I think there is a temperament side that comes from just my personality that is comfortable in sometimes uncomfortable situations. Like we talked about this a bit, where I think if you're getting really strong resistance to change, and I sort of sometimes delineate resistance to change in a couple of different ways. One can be people that are resisting change because they have been in an institution for years and are trying to give you feedback to be successful. And that you have to really discern that and really understand the difference. And then there's going to be resistance to change, which is, we've been doing it for 20 years this way. we don't want to change, right? And so that's a different type. And I feel this can sometimes be a little controversial, but the idea of like when you get that really strong resistance, I actually find that I connect that to we must be doing something right in the context of change, culture change, innovation, because why are we getting such a strong reaction? And it doesn't mean you go in with a blowtorch. It doesn't mean that you're, not constructive in how you collaborate, but it is a good sign that there's something directionally there. And I think if you're comfortable with that, it actually can be a bit of a North Star to keep going. And I remember that in multiple jobs where early on it was resistance to the idea, the concept, and then sometimes it can become personal. And I think if you don't take it personal and it's probably more about the concept or the goal or the program, right, or the office or what is going to be changing for someone, and you can truly empathize with how they're thinking about it, it gives you a different way to sort of engage with them and build their trust, right, and recommunicate. And I just feel like, that came out of some of my early work in consulting where you'd walk into environments and there just was resistance to what you stood for, right? And so when you can come to the conclusion that, well, that doesn't have anything to do with me, it shifts the way you engage. So you can engage with that individual, with the team, and really try to make the connection versus trying to ram something through. You know what I mean? For the sake of culture change. And I think when you do that, I've just seen it happen, especially in the public sector. A lot of people say culture change in the public sector isn't doable, it isn't feasible. I've seen it. I've seen it with individuals. I've literally seen the moment where teams shift their thinking. And I've seen, and I've been part of movements where in those early stages to what you're describing, you might have a big vision, but you start in a more contained, sort of targeted, small, sort of initial scope where you can fail, where you can have some challenges, where you can pivot and say, well, that didn't work here, let's go this way. And that's really the core of a lot of innovation work, because once you then deliver, right, and you show outcomes and you can tangibly show what has been the output of the work, you then start to create demand. You get the next cohort of leaders that are saying, wait a second, you guys did that in 3 months. Like, I want to know more about that because I have a similar challenge. And then you start to create more demand, which starts to build up a movement. And then that's that inflection point in culture change that you can really start to see. And I think it's possible in the public sector. It takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of patience. To your question, it's also something that when you hit these roadblocks, one, don't take it personally. And two, if you love to problem solve, it's actually like the best environment to do that. Because you can really break down a situation or a challenge and then build it back up with a team that's going to be new and more innovative and more successful for the future.
For sure. I think that insight about when you get pushback, that actually means you're in doing the exact right thing often is really something I wish I would have had top of mind way earlier in my career. Okay, Teresa, thank you. This is a great question. How do we find organizations focused on building partnerships between different sectors that's not in the traditional public health sector? So how do you identify who you want to work with?
It's a great question. Well, one, on a tactical level, I think there are a lot more organizations that are doing what Teresa's asking. So I was talking about Fuse Corps. I was talking about some of these digital consultancy groups. There's nonprofits like the U.S. Digital Response that I've been volunteering time with across the last year to help government and nonprofits think about the response to COVID. There are definitely components of that that are very public health oriented around testing and vaccination programs. And so the USDR is literally partnering with city, county, state levels of government and nonprofits to support them in their response, which a lot of times does have a digital or tech component, but sometimes can be analytical. It's someone with a public health background in biostats or epi could be a great asset to these types of programs. So I think one, there are a lot of more organizations that are either being launched or are building more visibility about what they've been doing for years. Because I do think there's a visibility component, candidly, Teresa, where I think just a lot of people don't know about what is actually occurring. I think on how do you find organizations? I think, sometimes they can be buzzy terms, but if you throw in civic innovation, civic technology, These are sort of, they're terms that in the context of environments that people are working in, people get it. Like when you say civic innovation to certain groups, they get it. When you say civic tech, they get it, but they can be a little confusing if you're not used to it. So then it's kind of, okay, does this resonate with me, right? So start to throw the net sort of wide. I mean, Fuse Core, U.S. digital response, civic tech, civic innovation. If you're interested in groups, organizations, nonprofits that are looking at things in a sort of a non-traditional way, I think that's a great place to start. And I know one of the things, Megan, we talked about, I'd be happy to put together a larger list of some of these organizations that I've had experience with or know about. And just we can distribute that, or you can distribute that to the participants.
I think that'd be great. Another thing that comes to mind for me, Teresa, is we had somebody from the Census Open Innovation Lab speak earlier in the series, and she talked a lot about some of their partners, and they tend to attract partners that are thinking more broadly about public health plus other civic technology areas. So that would be another place to look. But Niles, I like your idea of putting a list together. I think that'd be great.
Yeah, for sure.
And just on behalf of the Rollins School of Public Health, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us today. I'd especially like to thank Niles for sharing his time and insights and great advice with us. And Megan, of course, for facilitating such an engaging discussion. I'd also like to thank all of our partners at Orange Sparkle Ball, especially Sophie and Diego and Nick and everyone else who works behind the scenes for all of their hard work and creativity and continued support in this series. As Diego mentioned, we would love your feedback on today's session, and it is posted in the chat. So please do take just a minute to let us know what you think and ideas for future topics. And then for those who are able to remain online with us for the next 30 minutes or so, we do invite you to join us for the networking portion of the session. But before we do that, I do want to let you know that although this series or this session, I'm having trouble with all the S words, Megan. This session wraps up not our series, but our season, because we just are now completing season 1. We are already working on 2 amazing summer programs for your enjoyment, as well as season 2. So stay tuned for more information about those. But again, this is why your feedback and ideas on what types of topics you'd like us to discuss are so vital to the continuation of this program. So.